What will the future role of public space be? What are the new policies that public space needs?
Let me first of all make a little bit of a caveat, or at least offer a caveat in the fact that I don't ever use the term public space. So and let me just lay out the reasons, and then I'll talk more about address the question itself. I mean, I think I'm always a little nervous about these designations that are kind of fixed designations of public versus private. I think it's especially kind of confusing in the States. If you go to some of these shopping malls in LA, particularly the open shopping malls, are you in public space or are you in private space? It seems to me it's clearly a privatized space. And so I'm nervous about that designation. I was also, from a kind of theoretical perspective, interested in some of the work that Walter Benjamin wrote about space, about cities. He's one of the authors that I include in Rethinking Architecture, and I also talk about it in Anesthetics of Architecture and Camouflage. I think he's really an incredibly interesting guy. And he makes a very interesting observation in one of his essays about cities. He wrote a series of essays about cities, Hashish and Marseille. He wrote about Naples, about Moscow, and so on. And in his essay about Naples, he makes this kind of interesting observation, at least to my mind, interesting observation, where he talks about Naples through the lens of pumice stone. So Naples, of course, was Vesuvius is right next to Naples, and it erupted, and as a result, there's lots of this pumice stone around. And so he takes the logic of porosity of pumice stone to think about how Naples itself operates. And he talks about how these different kinds of spaces are actually more porous than we would like to think. So he talks in terms about how people, they maybe have their meal outside on the street and put their chairs out there. So somehow the public street becomes privatized, as it were. And also, from sort of say the Nolli plans of Rome and things, how seemingly public spaces can actually become, you can access them. So I think that that sort of neat dichotomy that's often presented between public and private is itself already called into question by those kind of practices. I published Rethinking Architecture in 1997. At the time, I forget exactly when it was, but the death of Diana happened, and there was this extraordinary moment when the public just colonized what is termed the public space. They laid flowers out for Diana. That was an extraordinary spectacle. And seemingly appropriated this space in a certain kind of way. And I guess at the time also I was living in Cambridge in England, and I was struck by how some of the outdoor spaces were kind of cross-programmed, as Bernard Schumi would say, how they kind of were colonized at different times of the day by different activities. So maybe they were playing cricket there in the afternoon, in the evening, or the language students would come into this place, Parker's Piece, and that was where where they would meet. So it was kind of interesting how space itself kind of can change its functions, a bit like somewhere like I think like Las Vegas. The hotels in Las Vegas, they serve as kind of gambling places. Also, I guess they're places for conferences, for dirty weekends, and I don't know what else. So the idea that kind of space isn't designated, doesn't have its particular logic at all. And I think we tend to assign architecture, give it a certain character, but actually, I always think that the character comes out of the performances that happen there. I don't think one can assign these kind of labels to space in that way. They shift over time, and they shift according to the activities that happen there. So instead of using terms like private or public space, I prefer to use terms like temporary strategic appropriations of space. Now, I don't think necessarily the term public space is so useful, especially in America where most things are privatized. But that said, I'll try and find a way to avoid that trap as such. But I would caution you against that term. I find it very, very tricky. So in terms of policies, I mean, in some ways, I don't know what policies are going to be necessary, but you can see already what is going to be happening. And in many ways, I think you have to assume that the usage of a particular space is going to be governed by the particular cultural conditions in that space. I mean, I'm struck, for example, when as a European coming to America, I'm struck by the kind of the psychological bubble that I think most Americans have, whereby if you get too close, they say, excuse me, which is kind of like, I think they mean don't get so close when they say excuse me, right? So, but it's kind of like, it's not something we have in Europe, and we kind of tend to get closer. So it's kind of interesting. I guess that's probably quite good in COVID. You could, I know that some people have been working on these interactive systems, which will kind of bleep out a message. I don't know if it's going to be excuse me or what, but when someone gets within 6 foot, that's going to be the case. And so I think, you know, you're going to get different behaviors in different spaces. I also teach in Shanghai, and I can't get there right now, but I teach in Shanghai in Tongji University. What I find interesting is how the cultural conditions between China and the States also change. I've taught a lot of Chinese students, not only in Tongji, but also at USC and elsewhere in the States. And what's very interesting is the different way in which they operate. I wrote something recently about comparing COVID to Blade Runner. And I know that normally you compare it to the movie Contagion, but maybe Blade Runner is kind of interesting because if you know the story of the original Blade Runner, it's about these replicants that infiltrated society. And what's interesting, and because they look so similar to human beings, you can't tell that they're not human beings. And therefore you have to have this special test to define whether they are or not. What I find interesting is that actually, although that movie was released in 1982, it was set on 19th of November 2019. And what's kind of interesting to me is actually the first detected case of COVID-19 was the 17th of November 2019. And if you think about it, the problem about COVID is also totally invisible. You also have to have tests. It's also very dangerous just like the replicant. So just to say that that's kind of interesting. What I find interesting about it is it's invisible. And of course, the same goes for AI, and that's another different question. But I think that we're in a situation whereby it's difficult to think about guidelines that are going to be universal because it varies from culture to culture. I myself I took the view I was following this before it was even called COVID-19. And because I teach in China, because I'm part of WeChat, which is kind of a bit like Facebook in the West, and I'm on several chats of 500. I'm a lot of groups there, and I'm following what's going on. I could see what was happening in China long before other people seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. And I predicted, I said back in early February, that the problem's not going to be in China, the problem's going to be outside of China because they're so disciplined in China that they will behave and they will be able to contain it. And I particularly think I thought the problem is going to be in the States because of the healthcare system here. I mean, I come from the UK, we have free healthcare, we take that for granted, and we come over here and we get horrified to see that there are millions and millions of people without healthcare. So I could see that this is going to be a real kind of issue. And as a result of that, my current prediction for the future is that actually we're going to be in a situation whereby some countries have all but eradicated it. We've seen that New Zealand's almost done that now, and China's managed to contain it. Meanwhile, in the States, it's almost certainly not going to be contained, you know, especially with the way that certain Republican politicians are arguing against scientific advice to open things up. My theory is that we're going to get what is effectively, I think, a bit like a new Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was actually built initially to keep the workers from abandoning East Germany and going to the West. So it was built by these Germans. But this wall that's going to come up is not going to be built by America. It's going to be built by other people who don't want Americans and those infected in their country. So I think we're going to get some kind of logic, global logic, that's going to be quite disturbing in some way and quite difficult for America. Some countries are going to be ostracized. And I think one can take that logic and think about it into urbanistic terms. I think we're also going to get sort of gated communities, in the sense that the logic of the gated community is going to continue. It's going to be exacerbated. People are not going to want other people entering their communities, and we're going to get gated countries. So I think that kind of like we've already got that particular problem in terms of our urbanism. It's easy to predict. The rise of nationalism, I find that particularly disturbing. Coming from the UK, I'm already disturbed that we quit the EU. I was very upset by that. I believe I see myself as being international. I've worked in many different countries, so I find that disturbing, but it's going to happen. it's going to happen. The other kind of obvious prediction one can make about COVID-19 is that that if you think about the model we've had in the past, it's basically been that kind of somewhere we've been trying to promote as architects, and I'm sure in your urban studies in Fire, trying to promote the city as a model of good behavior. Meanwhile, most of the time, LA has been seen as this kind of unspeakable sprawl. Now, really, the worst example of urbanism. Now that's all changed, and LA is now a kind of the perfect example of an urbanism of social distancing. So, I think what's going to happen, it's very clear, is that people are going to abandon the city in droves. I think the property market in New York is going to fall through the floor. It's going to be a disaster. Meanwhile, people are going to start looking for the countryside and places where they can work remotely. And I think that from that point of view, it's kind of interesting that Ren Koolhaas's exhibition in the Guggenheim that opened in, I think, December, Countryside the Future, I think it was called, was so far-sighted, because actually the countryside is going to be the future. People are not going to want to live in New York. It was kind of ironic that actually he held that exhibition in the Guggenheim in New York, which is the most dense form of urbanism. And yet I'm absolutely convinced that what we're going to find is that New York's going to not be the place to live. I wouldn't want to live in New York now. I'm quite happy living by the beach on Venice Beach, and with a breeze coming in from the ocean, and this with this kind of this urbanism of social distancing. So I also think that it's going to have an obvious effect on working remotely. This is an easy way to teach. In some ways, you get more attention from your students, and I don't have to fly to Miami the whole time to go and teach as well. And I think when people realize that, and they realize that, for example, shopping online is more convenient, then they will stop. They will stop shopping on. They will stop actually going to the shops in that way. I think in many ways we're going to be moving that way, and the future is digital. And unfortunately or fortunately, it's going to be digital. And of course, that will increase the digital divide and have all these negative repercussions, but the future will be digital. That means that, frankly, the high street or main street will collapse. Nobody will really be going there to go shopping. And I don't know what's going to happen in terms of all sorts of things are going to be thrown out by this. It's going to collapse.
What will be the future role of our streets? What will be the new forms of human transportation?
In the UK, there's this bizarre moment on Sunday evening when Boris Johnson kind of told everyone to return to work the next morning. And he said, but don't go on public transport. Well, actually, most people have been, the whole infrastructure is based on public transport in the UK. A lot of people take the train to work. If you can't use public transport, then how do you get to work? You maybe stay at home. And I think it's kind of interesting that, was it Twitter? Some company recently decided that everybody would work from home from now on. And I'm certainly planning to teach from home. I'm putting all my courses online. So all these things kind of happen. But the corollary of that, in some ways, is to say that if now you can work anywhere, you're not tied to place, then a comment I made a while back, and Paul Brilliant also makes, and also Bill Mitchell, is that there's a kind of revenge of place. It's not as though place is unimportant. If you can work anywhere, place becomes vitally important. So you want to live on Venice Beach rather than in some depressed industrial city in the Midwest or something. So that also changes this dynamic in terms of kind of property prices. You could see that there's going to be a kind of evacuation from New York and evacuation from all the kind of industrial, decrepit towns, and an incredible intensity for places that are beautiful. And this is a point that Bill Mitchell makes in an article in Designing for a Digital World. This is a book I edited in 2002, where he talks about the revenge of place. He talks about these teleworkers living in exotic mountain settings, and so on. So that's going to happen. So it's going to have an impact on all sorts of property prices all over the place, and so it's going to change things. It's going to change, obviously, mobility in the sense that people won't be so mobile. And so I'm a great believer in public transport, but I don't know how that's going to operate. I really don't think that public transport is going to be successful anymore. You're going to go in there and you're going to, you're going to go with your kind of sanitizer and things, and you want to sit anywhere. I mean, already, and that's why, in a sense, I think cities are going to be a problem because you have a shared lobby, and they were kind of, my friends in Shanghai were telling me how you'd go along with these ear plugs, buns, what do you call them, ear things, and you'd press the elevator button with that. You wouldn't touch it with your finger, and then you'd throw it away and things. So any physical contact in communal spaces is going to be seen to be potentially dangerous. So people are going to be living in their own apartment with their own entrance, with their own cars, driving to work if they're going to go out anywhere. That seems to me the logic was going to happen.
What should be the role of technology and AI in rethinking the possibilities for public space? Can AI be used to control parts of the city according to unexpected events?
Okay, so first of all, let me just say I'm working on actually several books on AI, but 2 at the moment for Bloomsbury, and I started working on this last year, and at the end of last summer, I woke up one morning and I said, this is really strange because I'm writing about AI, but it is both the most fascinating and incredible technology, but also the most terrifying. I came across that when I boarded a flight from LAX to Shanghai, and I went along with my boarding pass, and the flight attendant said, I don't need the boarding pass, just look at the screen. I looked at the screen and it said to me, welcome, Neil. Or I forget exactly, but it gave me my seat assignment. And I thought, how the hell did this device recognize me from everyone else in the world? And I was kind of, at that moment, kind of terrified and amazed at the same time. And so I find myself in a kind of strange situation, a bit like Elon Musk, who's he's using AI for his Tesla cars and so on, and his Neuralink project. And at the same time, tells us it's going to be the end of, it could lead to a 3rd World War, it could lead to the end of civilization. So I decided at that point that I found myself compromised talking about AI as being both a positive thing and a negative thing. So I decided that I would suggest to my publishers that I should have 2 books. One, a positive book about AI, which I'm not sure what it's going to be called yet. It was going to be called The AI Design Revolution, but I was suggesting to my publisher it should be called Alexa, Design My Building. And they thought it was a bit vulgar, so I'm not quite sure what it's going to be. But the second one is going to be called, so the first book's going to have a white cover, it's going to be about the positive things about AI. And the second one is going to have a black cover, and it's going to be about the negative aspects of AI. All that is terrifying about AI, the fact that frankly architects are going to lose their jobs. They're going to lose their jobs not because AI immediately is going to take over, but it's going to be a kind of extended intelligence, a kind of augmentation, a kind of a prosthesis of the human imagination, and it's going to be super efficient. And if you've got somebody who can access the cloud through their cell phone and design that way, you don't need an office full of people. So you get one person with a cell phone that will take the place of about 10 people in office. It's simply going that way. I was talking to Patrick Schumacher, and he says already in the Zohar office, they're reducing staff in certain areas because computation is more efficient. Eventually, what's going to happen, there's a piece online by Mike Haley from Autodesk where he says that you're going to, in the future, his vision, you speak to your computer and it kind of like gives you these different options. I mean, if you really push it further into the future, just as, I think AI knows our taste in music and Spotify and things, and recommends us things in terms of our political views or our other tastes and so on. I think very soon AI is going to recognize our taste in terms of architecture, so we don't even need to do anything; it'll do it for us, which is kind of terrifying, but that's the reason. Anyway, so it's both good and bad, and I think it's important to recognize that aspect of AI. In terms of surveillance, this is also an area which I think has been a kind of treated in a rather undialectical way, in that most people have assumed that surveillance is bad. At least that's been the kind of the traditional kind of, let's say, post-68 view. And I think most people kind of refer to Foucault. I'm sure that the theorists here would have read about the panopticon, which of course is completely misunderstood by architects. So I'll just say one thing. It's actually, he's not talking about a building. he's talking about a society. And the building is an illustration of that society. It's a diagram of that society. So architects think, oh, great, this is architecture. It's controlling everything and so on. No, it's not. They've misunderstood this in this very similar way to they misunderstood Deleuze when he talks about the fold. Deleuze is not talking about physical folds. And one of the problems of architects is they architecturalize these things. You know, they kind of and the same happens with, say, the logic of the discrete. You get people who somehow think because the discrete in computation is an entity, therefore we should talk about discrete forms in architecture. Or worst of all, I think this guy in the Bartlett, I'm just looking for his name now, Mario Carpo, who thinks somehow that because big data is lots of messy data, therefore that should lead to an architecture of messiness. I mean, it's not about that, it's about different processes. So anyway, that actually surveillance could be used in an oppressive way, and it's a kind of, I guess, it's a big brother scenario. That Big Brother's watching you, and therefore you better behave. There's another point I guess I would make actually also about this thing in that article that I was talking about, was in some ways there's been a sort of shift in terms of the way that people are controlled. Actually, in Foucault's own writing, in his Heterotopia article, he talks about how people can be contained physically in space. There's also that as it moves on, these are all in Rethinking Architecture, and as it moves on to Panopticon, it's a much more subtle kind of model where he's talking about how space, when it's configured in a certain way, the gaze can actually be used to help control, and the layout of a building helps the gaze, the efficiency of the gaze itself. But again, the point is actually it depends on how the space is being used. If it's being used as a discotheque or something like that, or a nightclub, then maybe you don't mind. You wouldn't mind being dancing in your cell and being watched by other sort of people. So again, I think it's kind of like it's shifted in a certain sort of way. But then also in Rethinking Architecture, there's an essay by Deleuze, Postscript to Societies of Control, where he kind of takes it even further. And what you get now is a further erosion in that hegemony of the physical, to the point that now we're to be controlled by invisible gaseous forces. And the example that Deleuze gives is credit. Credit is absolutely not physical. It's something which you, but it controls it. So in many ways, I therefore was kind of talking about in that article about Summer House London, about there are other forms of architecture. And I think I use the word architecture in a much more loose way than maybe most architects, although I am an architect. And to my mind, it's any kind of structure in any way, and as it is in computer architecture, right? It's how the computer is put together, the software put together. So in a way, there's an architecture of exclusion, that is based on the logic of credit. That certain people can't live in certain areas. I certainly can't afford to buy a property in Venice at the moment. So there's all sorts of different sort of ways, and I think therefore that we can think about this as being a part of that erosion. You can also think about it in terms of how, let's say, in the Middle Ages there were city walls, deeply symbolic city walls, but also functioning city walls. And now the way we enter a city these days, or leave a city, tends to be through some electronic surveillance city the system, a kind of metal detector in an airport and things. So all sorts of shifts have happened, and that have kind of crept in. But I guess the point I'm sort of making is that shift in operation about surveillance, I think we have to understand surveillance in a much more dialectical way. It is both good and bad. So there's a kind of movement that's kind of saying, actually, no, surveillance is actually not only okay, it's actually necessary right now. And I think if you kind of put this all together, you get a sort of, I think the notion, well, in the States, it's kind of interesting how people understand the term liberty. Coming from Europe, where, you know, in France, the motto of the slogan of the French Revolution was liberté, égalité, fraternité. I mean, the notion of liberty they had is very, very different from what they have in the States. The notion of what is effectively not liberty, but libertarian values. And that is to say, I should be free to own a gun because it's one of my constitutional rights, and that is put above the people have. I want to just quickly share my screen because somebody just try that. Yeah, just can you see that? Yeah.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah, that I think is just says it all. I will not trade my freedom for your safety. I mean, that's the kind of perverse inversion that you get in the States, whereby, you know, personal freedom, as it's called, is trumps your safety. You know, and I think that's, I don't understand this logic as a European. I don't understand this kind of libertarian logic. We've got to reconfigure totally our understanding of what is the role of AI. AI does control things, you know, and it controls things. I mean, not just in terms of COVID. It also can be seen to control things in terms of traffic. There's a whole system that I'm writing about in my book about AI in China. Alibaba, which is a big kind of, I guess it's like Amazon of China. Alibaba have a system they call City Brain. And what City Brain is basically, it's kind of like it's controlling, they monitor everything that's going on in the city and they control it, but they control it actually for a good reason. You know, it's basically to make sure the traffic flows freely. They can spot an accident immediately this way, and they haven't got to wait for somebody to go and sort of dial 911. That they can send someone, dispatch someone immediately based on those kind of things. So that in many ways is also part of the kind of the logic of surveillance, or the positive side of surveillance. Of course, the negative side is that there are stories that in China, and you have to connect your WeChat account, which is again everybody has WeChat, to your bank account now, and that means that there are stories that people are kind of jaywalking, and by the time they get to the other side of the street, there's a message on their WeChat saying you've just been fined $50 for jaywalking. So there are certain kind of, let's say, personal freedoms that are lost, and I think it means that you are inevitably, there's no space outside that system, which is terrifying. There's no way outside it, just as there's no way outside of capitalism these days. So we better get used to it. But it's part of the logic of how things operate. So my view is to say that actually that the attitudes are changing. Surveillance is there. It hasn't been necessarily a bad thing in the first place. I know, for example, that Space Syntax, who you probably know from the urban studies, they've been doing studies. I don't know if you know Space Syntax, but it's a lot to do with what your cone of vision, what you can see, and they found that actually people who would notice that there was a surveillance camera were more prepared to walk down a street, and also they were anxious about going down dark alleyways and so on. So to be seen actually is not necessarily such a bad thing. So there are all sorts of kind of ways in which we need to reappraise this, and I especially think so in terms of surveillance. So I'm completely with Zizek and Ben Batten on this. I think that we have to, the surveillance is good in some situations, and it is a fact of life these days. And I think from that point of view, personal liberty, which I never quite understood, is definitely shouldn't trump the public good. And I just wish the states had these kind of systems that were more rigorously applied in terms of healthcare and so on, as they do in other countries. I think we know that, for example, I think Korea got the first COVID case before the same day as the States, the same day, and yet they're in a much better situation because they were managed to, in a very top-down way, implement certain policies. So I think that, I think to sum up things, I just say that I think this is going to be a kind of real game changer, this whole COVID thing. It's going to turn upside down our attitudes towards urbanism, to what thought to be good urbanism. It's certainly going to, I think, change attitudes towards the digital. But I would also say that actually the unfortunate aspect of the digital became to be fairly obvious a long time back, that the digital has no agency. It can't do anything. It can't change anything. What it has is affordances. And I think this term affordance, for any theorist there, is a super important term. So architecture doesn't force you to do something. You can do certain things in certain spaces, but doesn't force you to do it. So there's certain affordances that you can get from the technology. It allows you to do certain things. So, for example, it allows you to book online. That doesn't mean to say that the digital is responsible for making you less environmentally sustainable. It's just simply that it allows these things to happen. I think one of the very negative sides of this is the fact that there's going to be an increasing digital divide. I'm already aware that some countries, I mean, part of our project in Digital Futures World, I found out that some countries have nothing at all in terms of digital. In fact, even South America, there's very little in terms of robotic fabrication, use of AI, and so on. And I think that divide is going to be exacerbated by this thing. I think that Amazon is going to do exceptionally well. I think it already is. And I think that the high streets, which are suffering at the moment, they're also going to suffer further. So we're in that situation whereby it's going to be the future. It's going to have an enormous impact on urbanism and enormous impact on how we live our lives. So I think it's kind of like, it's worth as architects, we don't tend to think forward, but we should. My big gripe about architectural education is that we spend our time looking at architectural history, which, I traveled to Alberti, so I kind of have background in that area, but, why don't we look forward in the way that, let's say, Liam Young looks forward, the way the movies look forward. I mean, it's kind of interesting that all of this was predicted in the movies beforehand. And, Blade Runner, Contagion, even I think Minority Report, and these were kind of serious implications. So I think we as architects are actually hopelessly nostalgic. We've got to seize the opportunity to think about the future because, we're meant to be, the whole of architecture is predicated on the future. When we design something, potentially it's going to be built in the future. So architecture is all about the future, but as far as I'm aware, it's the most nostalgic discipline I've come across. I think architects are extremely conservative. And maybe architectural educators more so than architectural practitioners because there's certain situations in architectural practice where you're forced to get to terms with what's going on, but too often you find that you have these professors who are kind of dinosaurs who were taught Le Corbusier and they still teach Le Corbusier. But I think already things have changed a bit. One of the things that I found, 10 years ago before there was Uber and Lyft, or 11 years ago, was that actually it's possible to get a taxi from certain areas in LA. Now you can use Uber and Lyft, and therefore it's kind of easier in some ways. I just think that we can't dictate anything. The property market is going to kind of shift in a way, and we I think architects, much as we ignore the question of kind of cost, it's one of the kind of issues that I've always, in anesthetics of architecture, I kind of talk about that is we privilege the visual and we don't even think about cost. If you think about any book on architecture, you won't find any reference to price, cost, economics, apart from the price of the book on the back cover. We just think, oh no, they'll love this design. But actually, of course, we know from those of you who've worked as architects, you'll know that the first question the client will say is, what about cost? And cost is going to be driving everything. And these kind of popular trends are going to affect things. That's something also just to say that, we think in terms of the physical, and there's a distinction that Deleuze makes between the intensive and the extensive. The extensive is the physical world, the world of dimension. And the intensive is actually something maybe you don't see. It's things like pressure, temperature, and so on. And I guess if you think about the world of the intensive as kind of hovering above the extensive world of the city, as a kind of almost like a weather forecast, a kind of meteorological kind of surface where there are high pressure zones and low pressure zones. But actually that is really what is dictating the property prices. Some places are hot places to live, and that's what happens. Everyone wants to go there, and the property prices go up, and that's really what dictates where architects can operate. We have no power anyway. We work with our clients, and everything is dictated by the market in that respect. And I think we have no option but to go with the flow. And we can't tell people, live and work, you should live in the city. They don't care. They're going to be doing what they want to do, and it's out of control. It's a kind of like, I think like a swarm intelligence. It has its own. It finds its own kind of logic. So we can't control that. That's the point I think about the point that I think that Kevin Kelly makes about multi-agent systems. I did one of my books was about swarm intelligence, and I think the thing about swarms is they tend to follow each other. A flock of birds, you're following the trends and so on, and the market does that. If somebody is buying Nike shoes, someone else copies that person buying Nike shoes, and all of a sudden the market shifts towards Nike shoes, and Puma shoes supper or something like that. So it's going to be out of control. We can't control it, and the market's going to dictate certain things, and I think it's going to take us into a completely new territory. So whether or not we as architects and urbanists think that the city centre is a good place to live, that the market's going to tell us something else. So I mean, and it's going to be sprawl.